Today's module is on learning disabilities. Before we begin, think about a student that you've had in your class or that you know who has a learning disability. How would you describe the student's strengths, the student's interests, the student's individual personality, and what struggles does this student have? Continuing to think about this student, describe how the student's skills and how intervention for this student looks right now. What kind of help does this student get right now? Next, I'd like for you to think about your dream for this student. What do you hope this student becomes, accomplishes, does 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, or more? The learning targets for this module include first to discuss the historical context of learning disabilities. You might be surprised to find out how recent our identification and understanding of learning disabilities is. We'll talk about some of the characteristics of learning disabilities and describe the 3 most common learning disabilities that you're likely to encounter in the school setting. And we'll talk about some broad strategies, and I'll give you some resources to begin planning for successful inclusion of students who have learning disabilities. There have been some unusual thoughts about how the brain works, dating back to Franz Joseph Gall's work in 1802. He believed that the brain was divided into 27 distinct organs and that each organ functioned independently of the other. That each of these organs was responsible for a different function like memory, educability, and perfectibility. Learning disabilities has been confusing to educators and scientists over many years. It's been known as slow learning. It's been confused with intellectual disability or cognitive impairment. It's been called minimal brain dysfunction, and it's been called perceptual disorder, among other names.
They didn't know what dyslexia was in the 50s, or they didn't know what it was in the school system that I was part of.
I first realized I had an issue, and it was different when I was 8 years old. The teacher in the class said to me, "Jerry, I want you to come up and read out loud." I said, "Oh," to myself, "this is big trouble."
Dr. Samuel Kirk in 1963 coined the phrase learning disability as he began studying how learning disability was different from intellectual disability that it was often confused with. He described children who had difficulties in the development of language, speech, reading, and communication. And as often happened in the U.S. in terms of disability rights and advancements, there was a grassroots effort. There was a group of parents that formed the Learning Disabilities Association of America. In 1969, the Children with Specific Learning Disabilities Act was passed, so you'll often still see in federal language or in paperwork specific learning disabilities as the name of the diagnosis. And of course, as we've already talked about, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, what is now known as Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was passed in 1975 in order to provide rights and services to children and families of children who have learning disabilities and other disabilities. More than 5% of school-age children are diagnosed with a learning disability or a specific learning disability. Up to 1/2, maybe more, we're not really sure, of children are unidentified. They're not identified as having a learning disability. You may have heard of students who are both gifted and have learning disabilities. And I've given you specific examples from my life and people in my life who fit that category. And oftentimes what happens is students who are gifted but have learning disabilities are able to cope. They're able to get by because of their gifts and talents. They're able to use their problem-solving skills in order to mediate the effects of the learning disability. Unfortunately, that's not good enough. Unfortunately, a lot of times students who are gifted and have learning disabilities are underserved, and it can result in students who are gifted but have low self-confidence, students who are gifted but give up, students who get by but don't feel very bright, don't have a lot of confidence in what they can accomplish. As we know from John Hattie's work, Visible Learning, and his meta-analyses of student performance, we know that students' belief in their own success is the most powerful predictor of their outcomes. And so oftentimes students who are gifted or not gifted but have learning disabilities feel as though they have an intellectual impairment that they cannot mediate, that they cannot succeed. And so that's a big part of our challenge in order to serve students who have learning disabilities. We do need to identify students who have learning disabilities so that they can receive appropriate services, but also knowing in international schools that you'll be served even if you don't have a formal diagnosis but you're struggling. It's still important to know if you have a learning disability, because this is a lifelong disability. Learning disability is different from a developmental delay. Oftentimes students have developmental delays. They just have trouble learning to read, but they don't have a lifelong disability. With some intervention, they catch up and no longer need services. That's not a learning disability. A learning disability is a neurological disorder that is lifelong, and it's important that we identify this so that students know that they have it, and they know what they need to do, they know what they need to advocate for, and they know that it is not something to be ashamed of. So a half or more, some studies say up to half, others say it's more than a half of students are not even identified. And certainly the group of students who are gifted but have learning disabilities are often not identified. It is important to remember that learning disability has nothing to do with IQ. Nothing to do with it. So just as many students who are gifted, who have average intelligence, those who have intellectual disabilities, experience the neurological disorders or differences that are associated with learning disabilities. So if 10-15% of people have learning disabilities, 10 to 15% of students who are gifted have learning disabilities. Boys outnumber girls in being diagnosed with learning disability. We're not entirely sure why that happens. If it is more likely that boys have learning disability, or if it's simply more likely that they're identified. Learning disability makes up the largest category of students who receive special education services in the U.S. About 45% of students who have an IEP in the U.S. do so because of a learning disability. The greatest percentage of students served who have learning disabilities is between the age of 10 and 14. One of the things that happens most often in the U.S. is that students with learning disabilities are not identified until 3rd grade. This is an enormous disservice to students. Yes, sometimes students who have difficulty learning to read have developmental delays. Perhaps they've had interrupted formal education. Perhaps they've come from a different school and the curriculum has been different and they haven't had the types of opportunities that would prepare them for the curriculum at your school. And sometimes they have learning disabilities. And we are able to, with the help of school psychologists, distinguish between developmental delay and learning disabilities. When we think about a developmental delay, that means that development looks like that of a younger student, of a younger child. But when development is different, it's progressing in a different way. It doesn't look like a younger child, it looks different. Then we start to suspect perhaps there is a diagnosis. So with the help of a school psychologist, we can discern learning disability very early. it is not too early to test for learning disability in kindergarten and first grade, and we should do so because the services should not begin at age 10. The services should begin as soon as learning disability is identified, and certainly with RTI we can begin services even for students who don't have learning disabilities. But there are certain strategies that we know are particularly effective for students who have learning disabilities, and we want to deliver those interventions at an appropriate dosage early on. It is much more effective. Students have greater outcomes. Students with learning disabilities have much more successful outcomes when intervention begins in kindergarten and first grade than when we begin intervention in third grade. Also, I want to speak to the notion of retention. Oftentimes, when students are experiencing difficulty learning to read or difficulty in other areas of the curriculum, in kindergarten, in first grade, we retrain those students to give them a chance to catch up.
I was kicked out of at least 2 schools and held back twice.
At the age of 5, or just a little over 5, I went to kindergarten and flunked out because I couldn't figure out the blocks with letters on them.
When I was a small person sort of starting in school, I was convinced that I was a fool.
It feels temporarily like this works. We begin the new year, the student is retained, and the student begins doing well. If the student has a diagnosis, or if the student has a condition that should be diagnosed, retention is not an evidence-based strategy. In fact, in John Hattie's work, we learn that it has a negative impact on kids. So regardless of the reason for the delay or disability, retention is not an effective intervention strategy. We'll talk later in the intervention planning course about other ways that we can support students who are behind, but retention is not the answer. Evidence-based intervention on the skill deficit and supporting the student's strengths and through interest-based learning opportunities is the way to effectively serve those students. So we want to identify students, we want to identify them earlier. One of the issues in international schools for you all to think about is parents are sometimes reluctant to allow their children to be tested and identified as having a learning disability. They're afraid that their children, rightfully afraid that their children may not be accepted if they move to another international school, or that the school that they're in may exit them if they're diagnosed with a learning disability. These are policy and communication questions that you all need to answer, that you all need to think about. How will you ask families, knowing that earlier intervention is better? How do you suggest testing? How do you support families through that process? How do you or can you ensure that your school won't exit the student if they are indeed diagnosed with a learning disability? These are important, urgent questions for international schools to address. So a bit more about learning disabilities in general. 10 to 15% of people have a learning disability. Statistically, 10 to 15% of you have a learning disability. 80% of students with learning disabilities have reading problems. So the memo here for schools is, if we're starting on a journey toward inclusion, we know that learning disabilities is the largest category that we will face. And we know that reading disabilities of that is the largest category that we'll face. You can get the biggest bang for your buck if you start thinking about universal screenings for reading and systematic intervention at the Tier 2 and Tier 3 level once we bolstered Tier 1 instruction, but centered on reading instruction. Learning disabilities, we are not entirely sure of the origin, but we do know that they run in families.
For the first part of my life when I didn't know I was dyslexic until I was 58, and my son was diagnosed with it in 2nd grade, and I realized that every symptom he had, I had. All that time not knowing what it was, I felt dumb.
So there's no coincidence that both of my children have dyslexia, and that runs in a portion of our family. And so if you have a parent who tells you, you know, I had trouble reading. I had trouble reading in school, and I had trouble with this, or I still have trouble with reading. It's possible that that person was did okay in school and learned to mediate this, and maybe wasn't even diagnosed with a learning disability. But so we can, as we listen to families and listen to what they share about how school went for them, we can sometimes glean important information to help us make decisions about students that we serve. Attention deficit disorder and other attention disorders are not learning disabilities. ADD is not a learning disability. It is a neurological disorder, but it's not a learning disability. It doesn't impact the way that a student learns new information. However, ADD, ADHD often, those are comorbid conditions. They often occur with learning disability. Some of the characteristics include academic difficulties. These are ones that you're likely to notice first. Significant difficulty learning to read, or with writing, with mathematics, memory, holding on to new information, being able to memorize information, and difficulties with executive functioning, difficulties being organized, organizing their space, organizing their time, organizing their materials, just keeping it together.
I failed economics 3 times in college. I also failed accounting. One time I failed accounting with a D, and I actually couldn't get it off my transcript for a little while because I didn't drop the class fast enough. Disorganization, anybody?
Social difficulties can accompany learning disabilities. As I mentioned before, students with learning disabilities oftentimes feel bad about themselves.
In the 5th grade, and we all have stories like this, the 5th grade teacher and the headmistress of the Hamlin School informed my mom that I would be lucky to one day hold a job as a cashier at a fast food restaurant.
Every paper that I wrote, I got a D or an F on.
I could objectively tell that, you know, everybody else could rock through their multiplication tables, and I could do my 1s and my 2s and my 0s and my 10s. And that was about it.
Every test I took, either I got a D or an F on.
And I was at a table in the corner of the classroom with 2 other kids, one of whom was probably autistic, thinking back. And the other was a juvenile delinquent, who I thought was pretty cool.
I could work as hard as I possibly could on learning those spelling words, and, you know, Thursday would roll around, and again, it would be red check marks all the way down the page.
We had the teachers' back. So when I hear President Obama or someone saying we have your back, that it means a different thing to me.
That was the most objective way I had of understanding intelligence.
We were the excluded, and that feeling stays with you.
They often feel that they're not bright and that they can't do it, and everyone else is smarter. And I'm continually having to correct that kind of talk when I hear one of my children say, you know, I'm not as smart as the other students, and that often happens to students who have learning disabilities. They feel like they can't do it, they're not bright enough. They can experience sadness, negative emotions. They can have difficulty perceiving other people's feelings and emotions. They can have difficulty finding solutions to social problems, social conflicts. And it can also be manifested in difficulty with interpersonal skills, getting along with others, learning how to navigate social interactions. There are three common types of learning disabilities that we'll talk about today. Dyslexia impacts a student's ability to read. So students who have dyslexia have difficulty with learning to read. Students with dyscalculia have difficulty with mathematics, and students who have dysgraphia have difficulty with writing. Dyslexia is the most common learning disability, and there are interesting thoughts that have developed in recent years about dyslexia. Oftentimes we think about dyslexia or learning disability as only a negative. We only see the problem. We only see the difficulty with reading. But there are a lot of good things that come with dyslexia, and we spend a lot of time in our house talking about the gifts that come with dyslexia. At the heart of dyslexia is a creative talent, a natural ability, a gift to see mental images, pictures, as if they are real, and to perceive these images from many different perspectives. People with dyslexia have achieved in every walk of life because of this gift, not in spite of it.
It's time to flip the coin and look at the positive side.
When I was 8 years old, I actually found my first dinosaur bone that year. And that was a pretty big occasion for me.
From the very moment that we began seeing students in our clinic, we were struck by the creative talents and cognitive strengths of dyslexic students.
But my release, my way of getting some sanity, some bit of peace, was to go out and play in nature.
As a neurologist interested in cognitive learning differences, I was impressed both by the creative drive and also the out-of-the-box thinking that these students had.
My way of recording information about what I saw was to start to draw pictures of everything that I observed.
Dyslexic processing has typically been viewed as if its essence were difficulty with reading and spelling.
When I was 12 years old, I built an exhibit in our library, and it's still there.
While the talents of dyslexic individuals, when they've been taken account of at all, have been assumed to be something that's sort of incidental to the wiring that makes individuals dyslexic.
This ability to turn things inside out and see them from shifting perspectives is probably something that allows me to write the poetry I write.
Now, it may not be surprising that that was initially the case, since people first noticed that there was a difference in wiring in dyslexic individuals as a result of the fact that they all shared this challenge with reading and spelling.
I've been fortunate enough to have a tremendous rise in my career, and I could give most of that credit to hard work. But I'd also say that that hard work is only fueled by my dyslexic wiring, which for me is a gift.
But this deficit-centered view doesn't make any sense.
I'm lucky, I believe, because I have this advantage, and I look at it as an advantage.
Because it's incompatible with what we've learned about the strengths that also accompany dyslexic processing.
And I was the first person to find a dinosaur embryo, a little skeleton of a dinosaur inside the egg. Now, here's our dyslexic question. Dinosaur eggs were found in the 1800s. The first dinosaur embryo was found in 1983. What advantage did I have over everyone else in the world for all those years?
Why do we still, with this information that's been accumulating about the link between dyslexic processing and ability?
I see, for whatever reason, and I know it's dyslexia, but I see the big picture immediately. I see it all.
Why do we still assume that at its heart, dyslexia is a disorder?
But some of my favorite moments in my job are when I get the call from someone that says, I need to pick your brain, or I have a problem and I need your help. And in about 4 minutes, they can deliver the problem. I can piece the pieces together, figure out where the dots are connecting, either highlight where they've missed something, or we can talk through how to get past a challenge, and then we've solved a problem.
Shouldn't we instead conclude that dyslexic processing is really a potentially beneficial way of wiring the brain, and that the payoff will come from learning how to identify, nurture, and use dyslexia-associated strengths?
People had convinced one another that they shouldn't break eggs open because eggs are precious. And so no one ever broke an egg open.
When we look at the way that dyslexic brains are wired and perform, it's increasingly clear that we're not dealing with brains that are simply trying but failing to work like everyone else's.
And the ways that I find that I think about things, if I can make something make sense for me, it's really easy then to translate that into something that makes sense for the rest of the non-dyslexic world. So just to give you an example of that, I wrote this field guide about the Sierra Nevada mountains. And I love looking at field guides. I never read them. I just look at all the pictures. So this, I know you can't see this in the back of the room, but it's all pictures. It's lots and lots of pictures. It's 2,700 watercolor drawings of the birds and animals that are romping around in the Sierra Nevada. And it's organized kind of like a map of my dyslexic brain. It's not dichotomous keys, you know, go to BB, right? And you go to BB and it says, you know, and it's follow the pictures. And so if you're hiking along and you see a wildflower, pick a color. A yellow wildflower with how many petals? 5-petaled yellow flower. I would go, ooh, look at the picture of the flower on the cover, and I'm going to bend it back, go to the yellow tabs. Now I'm going to go to the number 5 up in the corner, and yep, there they are. Here are the 5-petaled yellow flowers, right? This is how a dyslexic organizes a field guide. I didn't organize the mammals by color. There'd just be one big brown section.
Instead, dyslexic processing reflects a very different pattern of brain structure and function, whose essence is to create strengths and abilities rather than simply challenges.
Seriously, no one had ever found a dinosaur embryo. So I've gone back now that people saw that I could break them open, and glue is cheap. You can just glue them back together.
And it turns out that this sort of dyslexic map of how to organize the field guide works for the rest of the world. So I think that we have real gifts in the way that we perceive that there's a lot to share with everybody else. And it's not just for us.
I recently completed, as of last Wednesday, a book-length poem, a long poem that I've been working on in different aspects and different times, 30-some years of my life. And it deals with the welfare system and the Holocaust. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to remember back to experiences I had in the 60s. And I had no trouble at all in doing that. I was able to juggle 15 different stories to 15 different narratives.
The form the abilities take varies.
I published my first book that year and, of course, sent it to my English teacher.
But they relate primarily to skill in seeing large-scale patterns, to spotting relationships, or to recombining information in new and interesting ways.
Today I manage multi-million-dollar budgets, billion-dollar clients, and I do that because I have been able to find people that can provide me information I need to quickly make decisions. I can't look at the spreadsheet and tell you what you need to hear, but you can tell me what's on that spreadsheet, and I'll piece together the dots and the information and give it back to the team for information.
The dinosaur embryos that caught people's imagination and caught something, as the University of Montana, the very people that had thrown me out of college 7 times gave me an honorary doctorate.
These are the skills that lie at the heart of creativity and innovation.
I encourage you to visit dyslexicadvantage.org for a lot more articles and resources on the way we think about students who have dyslexia. Be sure to take some time and read about stealth dyslexia. I think in international schools this notion will probably resonate with you. Another common learning disability is dyscalculia. Dyscalculia affects the way that students recognize numbers, learn to count, estimate, measure. It it influences their fluidity with numbers, their number sense, their automaticity with math facts. It can affect their ability to memorize multiplication tables, for example. It can affect their ability with time telling. You may notice that students who do have a diagnosis with dyslexia may do okay with certain operations of math, but then have difficulty with telling time with a traditional clock, an analog clock. They may have difficulty with spatial relations, map reading. Then again, students who have dyslexia may show real strengths with spatial relations and map reading and working with numbers. So a student may have a learning disability in one area and real strengths in the other. A student who has dyscalculia may have real strengths with learning to read. Dysgraphia affects a student's ability to write. It results in handwriting that is very difficult to read, more difficult than you might describe messy handwriting. It can cause writing fatigue as well. It interferes with the communication of ideas because letters and words may be spaced irregularly. Letters may vary in their sizes. And we're not talking about sort of the typical progression of development as students are learning to write, but we're talking about difficulty in learning the spacing of letters and words that is different than what we would expect students who are typically developing to experience. Here are a couple of examples of dysgraphia. This is an upper elementary student. And this as well. You can see how the spaces between letters and words are not all that different, and that the size of the letters varies, and it does interfere with the ability to read what the student is writing. There are a number of evidence-based interventions for students who have learning disabilities, and I'd like to share a few of those with you that you can begin using in your own classrooms. Even as general educators, you can read more about these interventions and begin using these and incorporating them systematically and purposefully within your classrooms. Direct instruction is an evidence-based strategy for teaching students many skills. It began with reading instruction. It was developed by Siegfried Engelmann, or Zig Engelmann, and studied over a number of decades. We know that direct instruction works. One of my major professors, Craig Darch, was Zig Engelmann's student, and so I feel privileged to have learned direct instruction from someone close to Dr. Engelmann. The direct instruction procedures that I'm about to show you, for those of you who have an early childhood background, you may feel some tension. You may feel that this doesn't jive with constructivist principles, and this doesn't feel like what we know is best for early childhood. And so I'd like to help resolve those feelings of tension between following a student's lead and adhering to constructivist principles to construct truth rather than what feels like drill and practice. Direct instruction is explicit instruction. It's based on the idea of I model something, I lead us to do it, and then I test to see if you know it. It's intentionally sequenced based on decades of research, and it is based on immediate error correction and firming. So those of you who've had piano lessons, I remember these sorts of procedures with piano lessons, and I can remember my piano teacher saying, when I made an error, immediately stopping me, showing me what I should have played, what keys I should have hit, and then having me go through that piece of the sequence several times in a row to firm my skills. So there was immediate error correction and firming. So whether you're using Engelmann's actual products or you're implementing the procedures with books that children are choosing, we can still follow children's lead and implement the procedures of direct instruction. There are materials, though, that have been tested, studied over years, and are intentionally sequenced and effective for students who do have learning disabilities, for those who are struggling to learn to read for whatever reason, and we know that they're effective. For those who are concerned about, well, this takes the joy out of a student's reading because we're choosing the material and we're using these explicit procedures of immediate error correction. What gives students joy in reading is being able to. It's not being too hard. I can remember both of my children hating to read because they couldn't. We implemented direct instruction procedures. They became competent readers, and both of them are voracious readers now. My daughter blew through 19, 20 books during the spring semester. And so direct instruction does not in itself harm a student's joy of reading. In fact, quite the opposite. When they become good at it, they feel good about it and want to do it. We all enjoy doing things that we're good at and want to get better. Here's an example from direct instruction reading from Reading Mastery. And so it is a scripted intervention, again, based on years of studying the procedures. So this is an example. So I, as a teacher, would say, I'll say the sounds in boat, b-o-t. Now I'll change the b in boat to g. That makes goat. I'll say the sounds in road, r-o-d. Now I'll change the in road to t. That makes toad. And then I say to the class, let's try one together. Say the sounds in no with me. No. Now let's change the in no to o. Everyone, that makes low. And then I would turn to the students and say, now it's your turn. Say the sounds in toast. And I wait for the students to respond. Now change the t in toast to k. Everyone, what does that make? And we wait for the students to respond. Engelman included a number of signals that go along so students know when to respond. It can be a snap, it can be a point. There are a number of ways that you can choose to signal so that students know when to respond corally. There are direct instruction materials that you may be familiar with, Reading Mastery, SRA. There are many that follow the procedures of direct instruction. Many people are concerned about this idea of it being scripted. That feels robotic, that doesn't feel fun. But what we know is that research has demonstrated that students learn more efficiently and more effectively when teachers use the same wording from example to example during initial teaching of concepts, rules, and strategies. This means students aren't having to think about how you ask the question. They're not having to spend their cognitive energy to figure out what you're asking because you ask it the same way each time. Your signal is the same each time. We establish this protocol for this instruction so that it can be efficient and effective. For those of you working with young children, this sounds like something you'd get on TV for $19.99. You know, buy one, get one free, like a salad shooter or something. But despite the title that I think is a little bit hokey, this is effective. So if you have young children or parents of young children who are interested in getting involved and teaching their children to read and using principles of direct instruction, this is an easy way. It's an inexpensive book that you can get, Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons by Siegfried Engelman and colleagues. And this is effective. It does work. It's a way for other adults who maybe have not been trained in direct instruction to jump in inexpensively and begin to learn the principles of direct instruction to teach young children to read. How do you group for direct instruction? Of course, we could do an entire training on reading mastery or direct instruction, but the general guidelines from the research is for low performers, we want to have groups of 4 to 6 students. For middle performers, up to 10 per group, and for high performers, up to 12 per group. Now, we're not suggesting that you group students or track students permanently. The idea is that when we have lower performers in smaller groups giving more frequent instruction, that they will move to the middle and high performing group. Very different from the old way of tracking students, where you had high performers who just end up widening the gap between those students and the lowest performing students. The principles of direct instruction move the lower performers to higher performance. Repeated reading is also an evidence-based intervention strategy, and there is a resource that I've used before called 1 Minute Reader. I used it when it was on CDs. Now it's an iPad app, but it allows the student to engage in and be involved in their own assessment and monitoring their own progress of reading. One Minute Readers allows students to first do a cold read of a text, mark how far they got. It will calculate the words read per minute. Then the student reads along while listening to the passage being read, and then the student does a hot read, and they're able to mark words they had trouble with, and then mark their ending spot, and the program will graph and allow students to see themselves grow. This is a great resource for any student who's not mastered a 5th grade reading fluency. So direct instruction, as I mentioned, is based on a carefully determined sequence of introduction of letters and words. It also has its own way of shaping letters. And so I'd like to introduce you to the way that letters are formed and introduced with reading mastery.
So, to smooth the path to literacy, Reading Mastery has made a few modifications to the familiar English alphabet.
Hey.
Drawing a line over a vowel tells the reader there's a long sound, hat, rather than a short one.
Hold. Hot.
By joining certain letter pairs and presenting them as distinct symbols, a lot of confusion is avoided. Letters that are silent in words are written small, so kids know not to pronounce them. Finally, pairs of letters kids often mix up, like B and D and H and N, are altered to make them look less alike. And this is what you end up with: 40 sound symbols which turn English into an essentially regular language. While funny looking to adults, this alphabet makes perfect sense to kids.
Big voice, come on. Get ready.
Get ready. Did.
Yes, did. Good, thank you.
Get ready.
Good, big voice, but we've done all those already. Thank you, Precious. Give her a hand.
Once children learn these sound symbols, within no time they are able to read stories.
Get ready, what word? A. That's the next word. Get ready, what word? A. That's the next word. Get ready, what word?
B.
Get ready. The old coat had an old coat. Again, get ready. Everybody get ready.
The girl got wet.
Next, get ready.
He has a hat.
Everybody get ready.
He has a hat. He pops it.
Within a year, the more advanced groups of kindergartners are reading complex stories with understanding and expression.
What's going on? So they wet it as he popped it into the shed. The magic pouch. Did the little girl tell her mother where she
Once the kids are confident, fluent readers, the props are gradually removed. Joined letters are unjoined. Macrons disappear.
She said, where did you get
Letters take on their traditional size and shape.
it on the ground?
By the middle of Reading Mastery 2, children are reading perfectly normal text. Like adults, they will soon become unaware of how they learn to read. They will take their literacy utterly for granted.
Little pig, let me come in. No, no, said the little pig, not by the help of my chin.
To support students who have dyscalculia, we can use manipulatives in mathematics. We often do this with young children and tend to fade the manipulatives early on. For many students, the manipulatives need to continue much longer than we often do. Manipulatives is a good example. This is a good example of universal design for learning. Although it is essential for students who have dyscalculia to have access to manipulatives to build a greater number sense, manipulatives can help all students gain a greater number sense. If we think about what we learned in mathematics and how we learned a number of different operations, there are many things that we remember how to do, but we're not really certain how it works or why it works. Manipulatives can help us gain a clear understanding of fractions by being able to see the fractions, being able to see patterns in pattern blocks, and learn geometry through manipulating shapes is helpful. Many of us know that when we divide fractions, we essentially flip the second fraction, we invert the second fraction and multiply. But how many of us remember how that works? How could we use sheets of paper and guide students through folding sheets of paper in thirds and fourths to show that 2/3 times 1/4 is really 1/4 of 2/3? How can we show a variety of ways of dividing, multiplying fractions, using manipulatives to help students not only remember the tips and tricks to get through the operation, but to have a clear sense of how and why it works. Again, these are imperative strategies to use for students who have dyscalculia, but they're strategies that we can use at the Tier 1 instruction level in our core instruction in order to support all learners. Graphic organizers, another example of a Tier 1 instruction that we can use. We often use graphic organizers to help students organize their thoughts, remember components. In this example, we're trying to help students remember to organize their facts around a topic or a theme, and then cite sources of evidence, tell where they got this fact in constructing their writing assignments. We do this often with young learners. Might we use graphic organizers with older students, with students who have learning disabilities? Might it be another example of universal design for learning? With students older than we typically use this strategy in order to continue to build their writing skills. Oftentimes, students who have dyslexia master a level of competency in reading, but the difficulty then continues in the area of writing, not handwriting like we were discussing with dysgraphia, but rather in a way of organizing thoughts and organizing ideas and remembering conventions of writing and so forth. How can we use graphic organizers as a way, even with older students, to be able to support their ability to organize? What are some creative ways we can use graphic organizers with very young learners, using pictures and topics that are of interest to them in order to help them construct and organize their ideas? Auditory mnemonics are a good way to help students remember. We talked earlier about how students with learning disabilities can have poor working memory, and they can have difficulty with memorizing facts. And one of the facts that students have to memorize is the order of operations. In this YouTube video, we see a group of students who've learned a song in order to remember the order of operations.
Long division style. Division style. Long division style. We rock to the beat to learn division now in style. We learned the steps, repeat the steps, the song it took a while. Now we're pros, we beat the odds, we know the facts and rhythm. So listen, learn division, we do it Gangnam style. First set up the problem, you're gonna need the house. On the outside goes the visor, the inside trips you out. At first you might believe that the numbers are too big, but learn the steps and you'll forget you never did know how. Divide, multiply, then subtract, hey, and then read it out. Hey, divide, multiply, then subtract, hey, and then read it out. Hey, we got the rhythm, got the numbers, got it down, 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 down. Mommy, that's time.
I can remember my fourth grade math teacher giving us an auditory mnemonic, and it was just sort of a rhythm to remember the order of operations. She would say divide, multiply, subtract, bring down, and the entire class would repeat it in that way, and it worked. This worked for everyone to remember the order of operations, but is particularly useful for those students who have difficulty with memory. Visual mnemonics can also be helpful. How can we incorporate visuals to help students remember the differences between words that sound the same but are spelled different and have different meanings? How can we use visual mnemonics to help students remember left and right? I can remember in kindergarten teachers using visual mnemonics to help us remember left and right. It really wasn't an exciting visual mnemonic. It was just a picture of a bank and a person walking to the bank, and we were told the person was on the left and the bank was on the right. And honestly, for a while, I can remember discerning left and right by thinking back to that person in the bank. We can use visual/tactile mnemonics when we tell students to go like this to remember the L. When your hand makes the L, that is your left hand. If you hold your hands out, the one that makes the L is the left hand. Those are also examples. We can put visual mnemonics in our room to associate words students know, the sounds they know, with the letter shape. We can also use visual mnemonics in clever ways to help students remember commonly misspelled words. And here are some examples that we could use. Most of us probably remembered the number of days in a month by using this tactile mnemonic. What we do know about learning disabilities and learning a foreign language is that the data are pretty clear that without immersion, learning a foreign language for a student who has dyslexia is extraordinarily difficult. Implications in international schools, of course, with immersion, students can be expected to master a language. So if the language instruction is in English, the student's primary language is a different language, it is okay that we expect a student with learning disabilities to master English, and that is possible, and the data indicate that this is promising for students who have learning disabilities. However, placing that student then in a third language class, in a foreign language class that is neither the primary instruction language nor the student's primary language at home, the data are not promising for the student to be able to master that language. So we want to be thoughtful about students who have learning disabilities, and if we have requirements for a third language or a language that is not the primary language of instruction nor the primary language in the student's home, we want to think about alternate standards that student may master, alternate ways where we might consider the student's mastery of cultural standards about knowing about culture, knowing about history, perhaps of certain locations. But the data are not promising that without immersion, that students with significant learning disabilities would have great success mastering a foreign language. There are a number of resources for learning disability, but I want to point out one place where you can get great information on learning disability. I'm not sure why I pulled up the Spanish page here, but nonetheless, the page is available. The National Center for Learning Disabilities page is available in English and Spanish. Excellent articles here, excellent information for families, for teachers, and good information to help you think about ways that you might support different learners who have learning disabilities or learning differences. For your discussions, I'd like for you to think about identification of students who have learning disabilities. Are there students you can think of who might have a learning disability that may have slipped through the cracks? How do you team with your school psychologist to make these determinations? Are we identifying students who have learning disabilities as early as we might be able to? Do we anticipate challenges in guiding families to seek evaluation or to accept an evaluation to determine if a student does in fact have a specific learning disability? I look forward to hearing a summary of your discussions and to think about how this does incorporate with the goals for inclusion that you've selected.